Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
What are analysts for? Is an analyst a sort of referee, keeping the peace between the teams, or more of a leader, giving feedback and steering us down the right path? David Perring is a bit of both. An ebullient and popular figure on the circuit, he has a seemingly inexhaustible enthusiasm for learning, and it's infectious. I'm really pleased to have him on the podcast. I first came across David when he was at NTL, where he stayed when it became Virgin Media, moving to eLearnity, which is now Fosway Group. Fosway are one of the most insightful analysts in our space, with their 9-grid reports for digital learning, learning systems, and now talent management. We talk about David's role, the strange turning point that learning technologies seems to be at, our over-reliance on content, and buzz phrase of the month, learning in the flow of work. Hope you enjoy it. David, can you describe your role at Fosway?
Yeah, sure. My role at Fosway is I'm the Director of Research for Fosway Group, and I've been doing that for about 9 years now. And what that involves is effectively taking a place of sitting on the fence and seeing what suppliers are up to, seeing what buyers are doing, trying to get a sense of some of the trends, and use some of our experience of what's working and what's not working to say, okay, what looks good and what doesn't look good, based on doing our analysis, so to speak.
So what's the value you look to bring, and who is it for? Those two groups, practitioners and vendors, what's the balance there?
Okay, so we're probably about 60-40 in terms of our activity. Ultimately, we're independent, so we don't take any sort of money to endorse a particular product. What we effectively try to do is provide unbiased advice, which is based on research. Yeah. And some of that's qualitative through conversations. And then the other bit is actually giving advice and input into the people who create the software or provide services to say, this is where you're heading, why are you doing this? What value do you think it is? Your customers seem to be asking for that, but which customers really, and what outcomes are they trying to achieve? So we try and almost try and take the moral high ground in the middle, but without being overly judgmental, right? I understand at the end of the day, people are trying to battle against the realities of what it means to be in their business at that point of maturity, in that product life cycle, with those limited resources. Not everybody gets the millions of pounds that people at BP would have, and just understand, so really what starts to enable you to get a tipping point, or what you need to be talking about to get the resources to create a tipping point. So we sort of play on both sides, and I think that probably the easiest way to try and describe what we do is we try to act as a critical friend. Yeah. Right, so tell you the things that other people may not necessarily tell you, sometimes hold up the mirror and say, this is what it probably looks like and feels like, or sometimes just say to people, you really should be talking to these people in your organisation, these stakeholders, your end users, for example, and really sort of get closer, because sometimes that's part of the challenge is people are so wrapped up in trying to deliver stuff, they forget to step back.
So when you say 60-40, that's 60-40 in favour of practitioners?
Practitioners primarily. But ultimately, it's always a sort of a loop, if that makes sense. So we're trying to sort of use our surveys that we do through Learning Tech and HR Tech, which is now Unleash, to create a view, hold up that mirror. We do benchmarking with providers, so we've got lists of functionality, right? So there's 200 lines for LMSs, there's about 300 lines for integrated talent management, there's 200 lines for talent acquisition, probably got 400 lines for HCM. So we're going and saying to providers, what can you do? Tell us. And they give us a view, then we try and calibrate that. And what we're always trying to do is then plough some of that insight back for the buyers to say, do you know what? The functionality bit, which is what you usually focus on, we've got that, park that.
Right.
What are you trying to do? How will you know that you've achieved what difference you're supposed to be making, and who really cares?
Mm-hmm.
Because actually that's probably a bigger indication of your success with what you do with technology or innovation, as much as has it got the functionality. Actually, it's not the amount of functionality that somebody brings, it's the aplomb with which they deliver an experience to some extent, or maybe a reaction or an emotion. I think that's probably the most important part.
Okay, so while we're on the subject, you raised the word experience there.
Guilty.
I've titled this episode Learning Platforms because it feels to be like quite an anxious and unstable moment in learning technologies. Vendors are making big bets on things like LXP, but a lot of the trends in technology development and in the way L&D are thinking, AI, data, bots, being where the learners are, learning in the workflow, seem to pull in a different direction.
I think they're potentially the same sort of direction, maybe a different set of labels.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think we've hit a tipping point in what the experience was isn't really cutting the mustard, and it probably never really cut the mustard over the last 20 years, ultimately. I think it's been incredibly content focused, almost at the sacrifice of anything else that you could say is related to learning in a way. And maybe that's being a little bit provocative, but I think it's probably characterised of us falling into a loop of learning is all about delivering content to people. Content needs to be apportioned, assigned to people. You need to manage the content, therefore you need learning management systems to make sure that people get access to the right content at the right time.
Yeah.
And that's sort of true, but we know that learning isn't what you know, it's what you do. And I think that's something that's sort of missing. I think we've hit that a little bit of a fluidity, maybe it's more of a, not a burning platform point, but more of a transition point when the ice starts to melt before it reforms into something that it wasn't before. So I think we're at a point of fluidity, and potentially that's the most exciting time.
What happens to a destination platform when learning is in the flow of work? Surely, you know, it's no longer a place that you're going to, so what's happening with it? I mean, that's what I mean by things pulling in opposite directions.
I think there may be complementary directions. I'm not sure if they're necessarily polar opposites, but I think that obviously the context is shifting, and that becomes as part of the evolutionary starting point of where most of those systems came from. Ultimately, if you look at the roots of nearly all those systems that people have bought, learning management systems, they have been rooted in training management.
Yeah.
And they evolved to effectively start to change what would have been a traditional course into e-learning content, with partly the evolutionary step of thinking, actually maybe we could deliver a bit more of a blend. But the blend didn't really appear, probably to the extent that people needed it to. And in that transition of taking a course and thinking the course was then going to become something that was online, we lost a lot of other things around coaching, support, reflection, measurement, benchmarking about where people are at, getting team interplay, casting a wider net about peer-to-peer collaboration, loads of interesting things around action-based learning, setting people problems. And I think it's almost as though the way that the content and the systems led things was down into a way of mirroring what a traditional course would have been, rather than what organisational learning has more broadly been. And I think it's nice to see almost at this stage that people are saying, actually, there needs to be more to what people learn than actually getting things put into their heads. It's their skills, their abilities, it's encouraging greater feedback, it's using business data to get a sense of actually whether it's making a difference.
So you talked there about the LMS evolving, adding extra features, and now it seems to have evolved in something which is the learning experience platform, which is kind of another entity. I think I said to you before, is the LXP any more than a ragbag of features that wouldn't fit into an LMS?
I think what you'll find is there'll be a ragbag of features that will also appear in an LMS, right? And I think what's fascinating to me is this sense of learning experience platform is, in my view, significantly overblown, right? And it, in some ways, sets everybody up to be significantly disappointed, because ultimately the experience that we get from learning is mainly from what we do. And I don't mean, what I mean from that is, it's not until you try to apply your knowledge that you really get a sense of whether you're proficient. And it's not until you solicit feedback from people to say, how well am I doing, that you get some of the nuggets that mean that actually you get some pretty good insight about how you can improve. But still, the learning hasn't taken place until you've adapted. So this whole sense of sort of having action-based learning, the whole sense of solving problems and being pushed and nurtured to overcome challenges is what I think of as learning. It's not what can you remember, but I think for most people's experience from school, it's actually we get tested not on our ability to solve problems, our ability to influence and our ability to create resolution and take people with us, and evolve with the situation. We get told that actually learning is what you can and can't remember and what you can regurgitate, and that's not learning by any stretch of the imagination.
It might be too early to say that the learning world has weaned itself off an addiction to courses, although it's certainly in a 12-step programme.
Yeah.
But are we in danger of replacing that with just as strong an addiction to learning content?
I hope not, and I think that's probably partly the hole that we've fallen into a little bit. I think that what people claim to be learning experience platforms, for example, are really people looking at the issue of usability and user interface in those traditional platforms and saying actually the context, like you rightly said, for where people need to access learning is much more broad now. And therefore, because the situation or the context is changing, it's not enough to have a course. Actually, a course might be something that's useful, but to have support documentation that helps you go through a checklist to make sure that you're doing the right steps at the right time would be a great thing to add as performance support. To add a video of me doing something and then getting feedback from the expert would be a really interesting thing to do. So I think there is what's been painted as being learning experience platforms, and there's other analysts who've made a big play, not just in the learning space, but across all HR systems, and most systems talking about the experience, that people have got caught up in this thing about, oh, it's how it looks and what it's structured, not the emotional reaction or its practical outcome. Because ultimately what we know is that to have a good learning experience means that you need some point of understanding where you are today.
Yeah.
Whether that's through the eyes of other people, your own self-assessment. You've got to have some reflection on what that means. You create a little bit of a plan, whether that's on the back of the fag packet or in your own mind about how am I going to resolve that? Well, my good example, or maybe poor example, is if you want to change your light on your car, what do you do? You know, you think, actually, I know the situation, I can't do it. What am I going to do? Maybe I'll look at a video on YouTube. But actually, usually in a training context, in learning, in a corporate organisation, that's where it ends. But we know what life is like. You then have to try and take the bulb and contort your wrist into such a way that you actually get the bulb even into the right place and fail, typically. So then getting the feedback to say, actually, I still can't do it. What more insight do I need? I think there's a much broader cyclical view of what learning needs to be. And I think what we're seeing is some of the solutions starting to catch up, but the label LXP I don't think necessarily captures that full cycle. It's still about what did you need to do, what video did you need to watch, not can you do it and have you done it well enough that actually you could put 50 of those bulbs in a day.
Yeah, and that's not the label you use, is it? Fosway, you use next generation learning.
Yeah, and that comes from the education sector, right? They talk about learning environments, and they've done for a long time. They talk about virtual learning environment, and they started to come up with next gen virtual learning environments because they were also struggling with this thing about content being part of the problem or part of the opportunity, but also the bigger opportunity also being how you encourage people to work together to solve problems and learn, because actually that drives other behaviours which are useful in the bigger scheme of things about continuous learning anyway.
Okay.
So I think there's a few threads that sort of start to come together. So it's not something we necessarily invented. It's something that we borrowed and pulled over from another area that was so worried about content and curriculum, but wanting to create something, an environment which was enabled people to work together. But it still doesn't solve your problem of learning in the workflow, because that's maybe a different issue.
What would you say to a vendor who would say, this is unfair criticism because, we build the stuff and L&D have to put their processes around it, and that kind of the real learning happens with what they do with the kit. But you can't expect us to do all of that for you because we're not basically automating the learning process, we're providing a framework for you to use to do it.
I think they've been complicit in not facing up to the challenge enough. But just as much as the buyers haven't necessarily faced up to the challenge of what they should be doing as well, right? So we know that most organisations don't think about delivering multi-channel learning, they don't think about how they can support learners in the workplace, they do not support people getting feedback around how their learning has progressed. So that sense of applying learning in the workplace, people don't help, and when you think about how you sustain learning in the workplace, probably about 18% of learning teams do not think that's their responsibility. Mm-hmm. So I think you have a little bit of a what you might call a conspiracy of convenience in that there can be some nice sort of mutual finger pointing of you didn't ask for it, you never gave it to us, right?
Right.
And I think there is something that it highlights which is a deeper malaise around how learning teams try to foster what you might loosely call a learning culture. A culture where people proactively seek feedback, think about how they engage with others, and reflect and coach and support their peers in what they need to be able to do. And also sort of then reward not necessarily the consumption but the investigation as well. Because actually it's great to try and research something to find out how you should be doing something and do that as a team. So I think there's a lot of things that have been missing just from both sides, because to some extent that's harder to do, to create a system that encourages you to ask for feedback. Doesn't really happen. I mean, so should that be a responsibility that people just go and ask for feedback themselves? Most people don't ask for feedback, but it's a key to actually developing. If you've ever followed the stuff from Marshall Goldsmith, and he wrote a great article called "Leadership is a Contact Sport." Yeah. His research showed that actually you're as likely to change your leadership behaviours as random chance. As he says, you might as well have sat and watched TV than go on a course. The thing that enables you to show a difference is asking people in a systematic way for feedback about the areas that you need to develop. And what's interesting then is the combination of a course, or some things you might call a course, a practical learning programme, and soliciting feedback drives the highest personal change. Now, that was just for leadership, but I should imagine, without taking too much of a bold leap, that probably applies to loads of other areas, in any area where you want to have skill. So I think there's some really interesting things just around that sense of, so how do you facilitate feedback? I think there's some really interesting things just in terms of the maturity of learning teams, in how they approach people to learn about complex things, so when they're doing complex learning. So there's some great articles and some great methodologies called the 4CID. Most people haven't heard of it, right? But it's something that was pioneered in Utrecht University and Maastricht University. There's a guy called Mirenboer who's got some great explanation of how you do it. But what it's all based around is you set people problems, and you increase the complexity of those problems so that people get opportunities to practice what they do, right? And it's based around training doctors. And what they do is they start off with things like, okay, you've got a 14-year-old on a table, going to go do an operation for an appendicitis, they flatlined. What are you going to do? So they use that sort of problem-based approach, and then they have resources that people can dip into, and sometimes there are resources that people have to investigate to come back with the answer. Sometimes, depending on the stage of what they're trying to show people, whether it's actually you're beyond the diagnosis, now you practically have to show me the dials that you move, they then might transfer that into, this is your support checklist, like you get if a Coast Guard comes up and tries to remove you from a cliff because you've fallen 40 feet. They don't just move you, they have a little checkbook and a marker pen, and they mark off the questions that they've answered to make sure you're safe. So this sort of sense of building in structured practice, how much you set people problems, how much they need to know. I think it's really interesting. That's the 4CID model. But again, I've not met many learning practitioners who'd be able to say, oh yeah, that's an approach you could use to enable people to create complex learning. And the challenge that Mirabaud had was actually, when you do things, you not only have to know stuff, you need to be able to practically do it, but also when you're a doctor, you've got to make people feel better. So actually, because that leads to better outcomes. And then the challenge of actually, so the flight line you didn't manage to recover, what are you going to say to the parents who are stood outside, right? How do you get the rehearsal to even know where you begin?
Yeah.
And how do you get that depth of conversation about, actually, we've really looked into it, we tried to solve really hard to solve the problem. Then we got told at the end, you still didn't save the patient.
Yeah.
Tell the message. It creates a whole level of this, of what you might call complex learning. And I think lots of things that we go through at work, even in contact centres, right, they're complex things, right? You have to be able to do the processing on the screen, you have to know the products, you also have to listen to the motivation and emotional state of the customer, and you've got to try and flex to make them feel better about you as a provider or as an individual. Yeah. And that's really complicated. It's not so you get out of a course, but you might be able to get some practice, or you might be able to create some problem solving or discussion that enables people to use technology then to say, tell us what approach would you use to solving this problem?
Is this new mindset you see evolving here a threat to the vendor market, particularly content markets? Because there's a number of things here. There's user-generated content coming together. Yeah. There's go off, be agile, find the resources you need on the internet and YouTube and so on. Increasingly, I'm hearing L&D people saying things like, well, we've cut down the number of people we've got in-house creating content because, who needs another time management? They like to create content, they're creative people, but we don't really need it, we can buy it. Overall, do you see vendors worrying that there's a drift away from packaged content and bespoke content towards that resources, not courses thing?
I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting one, right? Because ultimately, for all of the sea of content that's available, the struggle is still trying to find the stuff that's any good, right? So we have a sea of content, there is ubiquity. Actually, you could drown in the amount of content that's out there, and actually, the internet is not shy on growing more and more content for you. And whether that's free or paid, it's not going away. So I think that it's a little bit of a catch-22. I think increasingly there is a ubiquity, but what there isn't is necessarily the provenance or the ability to find it. Now, obviously, we're seeing guys like Anders Pink start to target particular publications and use that as a way of surfacing ad hoc new developments. Yeah. But it doesn't help you contain that legacy of historic sort of tomes, things that you would always use potentially as a touch point, internally or externally. So I think it's a difficult one. I think it's such a broad market. People are going to spend their money if they got it. But if they haven't got it, they're going to go and look for it themselves. Yeah,
but perhaps that curation technology does help with one problem with content, which is that it ages so quickly. The shelf life of content. I hear people complaining about this, that it just goes out of date so quickly. It keeps like fish.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that it's interesting because I think to some extent content's not the problem, if that makes sense. In some ways, it's a problem that's easy to solve, and maybe that's why we spent so much time trying to solve it. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah, because it's low hanging fruit. I can find you some content for that. You can go away. I think what's interesting is if you start to think about that sort of continuous learning cycle. Yeah. Actually trying to create the business processes. And I think when we get into workflow learning, it's about saying, do you know what? We do enforce after action reviews after every project. Okay. And then we will capture the key lessons learned on video, in a wiki, wherever it happens to be, so that people won't make the same mistakes, hopefully.
Yeah.
Or we found such significant mistakes that we're now going to brief other people who come into these sorts of projects so they won't repeat things. Or we saw such opportunities by using this approach, we're going to find a way of getting that back to people. And I think that's the shift, is almost we've obsessed about the things that are available rather than focusing our effort on the things that are differentiating and also drive a great deal of inherent value and engagement and are all about the workflow. And I think this is the interesting thing. When I hear people talk about workflow learning, they usually think, how can I get content to people when they're in work? Okay. And it's like, yes, but actually would it have been better for people to get visibility of their mystery shopper feedback and explain what they're going to do different next time?
Okay.
Wouldn't that give you some really interesting content?
Okay, so it's felt to me in this discussion that you are talking about learning in the flow of work, but it also seems you mean something slightly differently to what a lot of other people, which is kind of perhaps delivering bits of micro-learning, chopped up little bits of courses into work. Yeah. What you're talking about, it feels like something very different. Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping it's sort of things that people would encourage people to do naturally. Yeah. But I don't think I just see much encouragement of it. I think what's interesting, we see loads of things, say, around micro-learning. There's some really good stuff that's happening out there where people are using micro-learning platforms, people get drip-fed a little bit of content every day, they're able to stay current on their knowledge around their product, especially in retail context. Has a massive impact on profitability of stores and things like that. So that micro-learning can have a lot of value. Mm-hmm. Is it really driving people to close better sales? What we've heard some really interesting things from a French retailer where they have their shops in two sides, right? And what they've realised is depending on whether a customer turns left or right, shows their brand stickiness, right? And their propensity to spend. So in a store, what they start to do is they start to say, how many people have got on the left? I'm not really that interested in them because they're not brand lovers. They're buying our cheaper products and they're never going to buy the bigger stuff. Right. The person over here is on the opposite side of the store. They're a brand lover and they spend high. I need to look after them. So they use some of that knowledge about they're learning from the data, they're learning from the feedback loops in the stores to then capture and try and follow behaviours through. Okay. So you could say that's a little bit knowledge, that's also a bit of coaching, it's also a bit of following up, but also maybe it's a little bit of camera tagging to see how many times are our stores people also going to follow the high value customer?
But it's not content.
Yeah.
It's data.
It's data. And I think that's the interesting thing. Again, on that sort of side of content, I had some interesting conversations with guys that used to work with not so long ago around if we thought about content not just as being the knowledge bits, but we also thought about it as being the diagnostics. It's like my self-review, my mystery shopper review. It's what the feedback I've had from the product owner who just saw me explain how I'd sell their product, right? That's other set of data. That's personal data. Maybe it's the psychometrics, all these other bits of information that actually we can enrich the learner around. And I think that's when we talked about the fluidity earlier on. Yeah. Yes, it's a lot of fires around maybe some of the existing providers, but also a great opportunity because I think that data-led approach will start to surface itself more for learning teams over the next 10 years. I'm not sure if it's necessarily word panacea, it's not going to change everything, but I can see a consumerization of what we do, which you'd hope will come in the next 10 years. It may happen in 5 years, I'm not so sure. I don't see enough people demanding it, but I think that's my hope is that actually we'll end up with things that are much more personalised and tailored because we have a much richer understanding both of the business data and the individual data to nudge people about saying, you might want to look at this, you might want to have a conversation with these people who excel at doing this.
The Learning Hack podcast is brought to you by John Helmer Consulting. If you're a startup or scale-up looking to grow your business in learning technologies, we offer 20 years experience and all the creative and strategic support you need. To make a real impact with your marketing and thought leadership, visit johnhelmerconsulting.com today. Do we have a siloed problem? I've heard people say XAPI isn't going to solve the problems, we need data lakes because we don't want to silo our data off.
Yeah, you're totally right. I think the biggest problem is the visibility of the data that you're interested in, L&D don't have access to. Usually when you talk to people from HR, they talk about people data, but people data doesn't mean real performance data. You might have your annual review, but that doesn't tell you how much customers love you and how much the business profits from you being around, or how much you help other people because actually you're a really strong team player and the people around you excel because all these things. So there's a lot of siloed data which isn't broken out, and I think XAPI, when we spoke to the guys at Rustici a while ago, that it was really interesting. They said SCORM parity is not the story. It's about reaching out into your business data, which is really the
Explain
important
what you mean
stuff.
by SCORM parity.
Oh, so actually knowing that you've done this section on this piece of courseware is not what the LRSs and XAPI is about. It's not about tracking your score. It's about surfacing other data sources ultimately, and I think that's really what's interesting about the guys at HT2.
Ben Butts.
Ben Butts, and the great things they've done with the guys at Villeroy Bosch, right? Control groups, you can see the impact because of the resources that are available to people and the programs that they've gone through. You can see the upsell in stores. And 6% increase in sales, right? That's not to be sniffed at. From the control group, only do 1%. It's significantly different. But it's really interesting. But so I think you're 100% right. And I think that the challenge is maybe surfacing the learning data into the business data. But as we know, most of the business analysts, the people who are good with big data and data analytics, are more interested in your sales and your marketing funnel and your customer satisfaction funnel, not necessarily in your learning data. And I think there are some brave learning teams who are going out and saying, do you know what? The correlation between what people know and how well proficient they are at doing stuff might have some impact on our performance as an organisation. But some of that's even bigger, right? And there's some great McKinsey stuff from about 2012. There's some study around it, and basically it just shows the impact of high performers. And basically, and they did the study originally in 2002, they repeated it in 2012, so you have to assume they're going to repeat it in 2022. Your high performers will outperform your low performers, or average performers should I say, by 800% in complex tasks. They will run rings around another team. And this is the interesting thing, when you're thinking about learning, it's not just because it enables people to perform in their role, it's also a critical part of your employee value proposition to attract the sort of high performers who will help you outperform your competition. 800%, they're 8 times faster or better at doing stuff. But it's fascinating, right? And that's just that McKinsey study, and they sort of talked about, just think about the timeline. Somebody takes 8 weeks to do something, the team do it in a week. Somebody takes 8 months to do something, they do it in a month. And it's just like, okay, that's a little brain implode, because it helps you realise how much that your learning brand, which is one of the key reasons that for most of the research, whether you look at Burson, whether you look at us, whether you look at Accenture or Deloitte, anybody's research tends to point to career development and learning as being the top driver for why individuals want to join your organisation. Assuming also that you haven't got all the flack around managers and performance of organisations not going down the tubes. That's why people go to Glassdoor, right? And you'll find the bottom list on the variables of Glassdoor when you look at the ratings is career opportunity and development. And if you think about what your employer brand is, it's very visible to people. It's not what you put on your website, it's what people put there. So there's a real pressure, I think, and again, this is the complexity of what we do as learning professionals, is we're dealing with individual performance, we're dealing with team performance, we're dealing with divisional performance and helping people develop to deliver results, because that's the key cultural driver for nearly all organisations. We're also trying to build an employer brand, which is irresistible, because we want the best people to join us, which is part of that virtuous circle. We can't afford or don't have the resources to deliver content and training all the time. We need to create what euphemistically you might call a learning organisation, and I'd say that's about trying to create coaching and feedback and soliciting feedback as part of our underlying philosophy. And I think that's one of the things that's been a little bit disconnected. Systems have sought to deliver training organisations. They haven't always sought to deliver learning organisations.
So the learning organisation is a concept that's been around for quite a while. Have you seen any?
No, well, not so many. I think that usually they're quite hidden, and I think that's the thing, is learning departments get so still caught up in the training department, and that's what people expect them to deliver, right? And that's what you also have to deliver. That's part of the price of admission. You have to give people a little bit of what they expect you to give them, but also then trying to facilitate the sorts of skills that enable you to be a learning organisation, I think are quite often quite missing. If you thought about the number of organisations that we see who give people their own money to say, go and invest that as you want, or give them their own platform like Me Time, to go and say, fill your boots. If you want to go do horse psychology or dog whispering or photography, yoga, whatever you want to do, get into the habit of learning and sharing what you've learned, right? That is a big cultural shift. A number of organisations we see that, probably diddly, right? And what again was fascinating is, again, great McKinsey study talking about, it was a great study that was in Harvard Business Review about culture. 97% of CEOs or the organisational leaders want to have more of a learning organisation. Right? And what's fascinating is when you look at the definition of what they mean by learning, they mean experimental, open-minded, innovative, people who are willing to fail, because what they mean by learning is trying, adapting new things, right? They don't mean study more, right? And I think that within there is a really interesting thing about how organisations cope with shifts in their market, how they cope with transformation, all the things that are coming with new tech. I think people are struggling to find their way through that, but ultimately the learning organisation, coming back to what we said before, is the willingness to experiment. So how much is what we do when we put people through a programme even encourages them to experiment and feedback? So this sort of learning culture, you can see us almost knocking over a couple of dominoes if we focus on the right thing. But it's more than delivering just the training.
Right. As an analyst, how much do you feel you work with an organisation's learning culture? What are the levers that you have at your disposal to change this situation in the positive way that you'd like to see?
Oh, it's tough. I wish it was easy. Because sort of going back to what we said before, people are at different stages of maturity and levels of investment, and there are only 24 hours in the day. Most people are trying to squeeze in 48 hours, right? So actually the ability to change and deliver a step change, sometimes the organisation itself isn't ready, right? So it's not a simple, if I do these things, therefore this trail will unfold before me. The world is too complicated. And I think that's probably one of the joys of being an analyst and what we do, acting as that critical friend, but also one of the biggest challenges, because you're trying to help people understand, ultimately, how can you drive the biggest value in the shortest amount of time, try and get you away from boiling the ocean to deliver something that gives you enough punch, that gives you enough credibility to turn the volume up next time. And I think trying to help people think, so almost, what can I do tactically which fits into my strategic direction? And I think that's probably the thing that is the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity, because ultimately most people don't have the luxury of waiting 6 months for something to appear. Some organisations do, most don't.
And in your engagements with corporates, it's of a limited time period, isn't it? It's not
exactly.
You have the experience of having been a head of L&D and so on. But you have a role, you think, well, I can leave that till next year, or, I've still got a job next year. Or, that's a long-term thing, that's a short-term thing, and so on. But you're saying as an analyst, you have to do something tactical, which is going to have a strategic effect, because it's...
You need to be able to move the dial, and I think that's sometimes what we need to get people to a point of realisation, and maybe that's also the point of learning, is sometimes they do need to make a big decision. Right? And sometimes that's, do you know what, the team I have today isn't the team I need tomorrow, right? I need to fundamentally upskill and remodel not only the people in my team, but the skills in my team and the structure of how it works in order to enable me to embrace a broader set of what I need to do.
Okay.
And that realization sometimes takes a lot longer. And just to say, walk in and say, well, actually, you've got the wrong team doing the wrong things at the right time, or the wrong time, we would say that, right?
Yeah.
But that's not helpful
Yeah.
because you've got to try and find a journey that enables you to deliver and keep the business moving.
Yeah.
So it's always sort of just thinking, so what can you do which enables you to take people with you and enable you to move those things forward? It's not simple. And I don't, again, having been in that place.
You do a lot of very
tough.
useful kind of hands-on stuff like that, but then there is also the kind of comms side of the role. And this is where I often see a bit of the opposite of love for analysts. How to respond to the criticism some people have. I'm not sure about you,
Yeah,
particularly
sure,
about
happy to have
Fosway, but
criticism.
I've heard about certain
Sure.
criticisms I've heard of certain analysts that they're too much in the business of whipping up hype around a fashionable new product category or buzzword.
I think that's probably true, right? There are analysts out there who have created whole new categories, and maybe XP is a good example, right?
Yeah.
And that is both in response to demands in the marketplace and what they're seeing shaping around them. I think from our point of view, and I can only speak for us, right? David Wilson, who set up the organisation, has had two things that are sort of driven what we do. The first is be unusually direct, right? That's part of the brand values of Fosway. If we don't think it's right, we'll say it's not right. And I've written pieces about what I do and don't believe about the LXP as an article that's been on LinkedIn for 8-9 months. So we try not to get whipped up into a fervour, because I think for us what we're interested in is what creates the right sort of outcomes, right? So if somebody can present to us an LXP that has driven tangible outcomes for a business unit, like the stuff that Ben Betts has done at HT2 with Villeroy Bosch and others, and the guys at Restici have done with Barclays, really interesting stuff.
Now Learning Pool, of course.
And now Learning Pool. But those sorts of things, if people can show us that, we'll happily talk about that. Because what we're interested in is what outcome did it create, what was your context, and how the hell did you get there, and what tools did you use?
Yeah.
So for us, that's the story that we're interested in telling. And it's always about the outcome first, and then tell us your journey, because actually some people don't have the jetpack that certain organisations have. Sometimes others might have similar challenges, so actually it's easy for them to follow in your footsteps.
Yes.
But I think what we talk to people about is having an innovation plan. So if you do get caught up in some of the shiny things, and it's right to experiment, that's all part of being a learning organisation, at least know how you're going to pilot them, know what ones are hot topics for you and what stakeholders should be interested and what difference that make. Pilot and prove them. If they pilot and fail, that was interesting learning, you might want to try it again later, or you might want to chuck it in the bin.
Okay.
But at the point when you've got some proof that it's making a difference, step up, scale it on, use it more. So I think our approach to maybe some of the shiny tools has been, we don't know if haptic gloves for virtual reality is the right thing for you. But it could be. If you're in the building trade and you want to train people to do virtual soldering or putting in plumbing, actually that might show people the right process, and it might be better than holding the sort of Wii handles, what they call them, controllers, that you used to have. It'll make people more prepared. So actually, if you can translate it back to your context, it probably will be right for you. But don't just jump straight in. Find a discrete group. And I think what our research has shown typically is you've got a 50-50 chance of getting it right.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right?
It's that high.
It's that high, yes. And basically that's on the basis of people thinking that it was very good is your 50%, and then 50% acceptable or poor. Now, for me, I think acceptable is not good enough. So you could, if you're being charitable, say, well, acceptable, sort of acceptable. But I never go to a restaurant thinking I really want a meal that's acceptable. I'd rather something was good. So I think 50-50 both on platforms, and that comes down depending on some of the newer platforms. And that's sort of things like virtual reality, etc. So you sort of do play a bit more of a risk when you're experimenting more. But even on the LMSs and the LXPs, right? People's satisfaction as a buyer, this is something people have paid other people's money for, 50-50 chance.
Oh.
And you just think, okay, why did that happen?
Yeah.
And what have you learned from it?
When you look at the current state of things in L&D and talent, are you more optimistic or pessimistic for the future?
I'm incredibly optimistic. Maybe
Is that just because you're an optimistic kind of guy?
I think so. I think possibly so. But I think also what I'm seeing is I think we're seeing a step change in the generations of people who are now learning leaders.
Yeah.
And I think that is enabling the next set of expectations to arrive.
Okay.
So people who started with my grey hair when there wasn't any tech, and actually to start to use tech in learning was a really big step.
Yeah.
Introducing virtual classrooms, wow. Having bite-sized learning on demand, wow, that's really amazing. Putting it over the internet, wow. Yeah. Right, these are big steps. At the time, when you look back, you think actually they were steps maybe partly down a blind alley, but it was part of the evolution, right?
Yeah.
People coming in now have a different expectation. Can't see time for a course. All the millennials who are coming into the workplace say that they want more coaching. Right? So that should put pressure from people who are now learning leaders, because they are millennials themselves, to say, how are we going to create more day-to-day coaching? How are we going to create stronger career paths so that actually after a year I haven't had to wait for a promotion or go somewhere else for promotion. I've actually had my promotion 3 times already.
Yeah.
What a great story. So I think there's some interesting things that the expectations change. We're seeing that in the demographics, in the way that people use tools. There's so many more social collaboration tools, Slack, workplace learning, people just using Microsoft Teams. It's changing the way people interact, and I think it's about helping people start to clue in to what those tools mean potentially for our learning practitioners now, because they're routine. If that's the basis for now gathering feedback in a systematic way, wow, isn't that an interesting development? Don't have to spend any money. It's already in ambient. So I am incredibly optimistic, because I think because of this fluidity in the marketplace, we're seeing the sort of generational step. It's almost like moving from petrol cars to electric cars, right? We're still in that phase. We're still moving to a better world, hopefully. And but that comes to the generational maneuver. It comes with people thinking differently about what their expectations of learning is, the resources that are available, and I think that's a great opportunity. And there's so many things that are happening around us already. You can see the stuff coming with data analytics is evolving, people understanding of how they can use algorithms to do interesting things, and I'll say interesting things in HR. So they're already using facial recognition in some interviews to understand what sort of person you are. Scary, right?
Yeah.
But we're going through that learning phase. We won't get it right first time. Might not get it right 10th time. Eventually we'll get it right. And I think that sort of builds a lot of hope for the future.
Moving to a better world. That's a good place to end it on, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Cheers. That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to David Perring, our guest. The Learning Hack is completely independent of any vendor, company or body, so if you want to help us sustain it into the future, please make sure to like and subscribe, and it's important, if you want to help other people to find us as well, to give a 5-star rating on whatever platform you get your podcasts from. You can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Next time on The Learning Hack, we have Caroline Ford of the unfortunately now demised Thomas Cook, there's a story there, and she'll be telling you how to do innovative learning on next to no budget. Don't miss it. So see you then, and until next time, bye-bye.
Now I finally get it.
Very good. You might have a long edit. My apologies. which is
I always have a long edit.